the invention of the wilderness patriarch, myth, performance, and the architecture of belief ***. For nearly 3 decades, Billy Brown occupied a singular position in the American cultural imagination, a self-fashioned wilderness patriarch whose life appeared to offer an antidote to modern alienation. In a media landscape saturated with artificiality, irony, and spectacle, Brown's public persona promised something purer, authentic struggle, familial unity, and moral clarity forged in the crucible of nature itself. As the narrator and central figure of Alaskan Bush People, Brown did not merely appear on screen, he authored a myth. He constructed a coherent narrative of exile from civilization and rebirth in the wilderness, positioning himself as both architect and exemplar of a life uncorrupted by modern excess. Yet myths are not lies in the conventional sense. They are stories that ask to be believed because belief itself fulfills a psychological and cultural need. Billy Brown's myth endured not because it was airtight, but because audiences wanted it to be true. This desire, shared by viewers, producers, and even Brown's own family, allowed a carefully curated fiction to function as reality for years. The unraveling of Brown's double life after his death in 2021 did not merely expose personal deception, it revealed how charisma, narrative authority, and media infrastructure can collaborate to manufacture belief on a massive scale. This chapter examines the origins of Billy Brown's public persona, not as biography alone, but as a deliberate act of narrative construction. It explores how Brown positioned himself as a modern frontier hero, how Alaskan Bush People functioned as a vehicle for myth-making, and how early cracks in the story were systematically ignored or dismissed. Understanding the architecture of Brown's legend is essential, because his later deceptions, romantic, financial, and emotional, were not deviations from the persona. They were enabled by it. To understand Billy Brown's appeal, one must situate him within a long tradition of American frontier mythology. From Daniel Boone to the rugged cowboys of early Hollywood westerns, the wilderness has served as a symbolic space where masculinity, independence, and moral authority are tested and affirmed. The frontier hero is typically imagined as self-reliant, morally upright, and resistant to institutional control. He exists outside the corruption of cities and governments, guided instead by natural law and personal code. Brown's genius lay in adapting this myth to contemporary anxieties. In an era defined by economic precarity, digital saturation, and environmental dread, his narrative offered a fantasy of escape and mastery. He did not merely survive the wilderness, he raised a family within it, suggesting that authenticity and virtue could be inherited rather than learned. The Brown children, framed as innocent, capable, and loyal, functioned as living proof of the success of his philosophy. Crucially, Brown cast himself not only as a survivor but as a teacher. His gravelly voice, deliberate pacing, and moralizing monologues lent the show an almost scriptural tone. Each episode reinforced the idea that hardship purified character and that suffering, when chosen, was ennobling. This rhetoric resonated deeply with viewers disillusioned by modern life, eager to believe that meaning could still be found through simplicity and struggle. Although marketed as unscripted, Alaskan Bush People was not a documentary in any neutral sense. It was a narrative product shaped by editing, production constraints, and, most importantly, Billy Brown's authorial control. Unlike many reality television figures who are shaped by producers, Brown positioned himself as the story's primary narrator. His voice framed events, interpreted conflict, and assigned meaning to hardship. This narrative authority is significant. By controlling the story, Brown controlled perception. Inconsistencies, such as unexplained access to resources, suspicious timelines, or sudden shifts in location, were absorbed into the myth rather than interrogated. The wilderness itself became elastic, capable of accommodating hotels, medical facilities, and production crews without threatening the illusion of isolation. Brown's storytelling was not merely persuasive, it was strategic. He emphasized timeless struggle over logistical specificity, emotional truth over factual accuracy. In doing so, he aligned himself with a long tradition of charismatic leaders who blur the line between metaphor and reality. What mattered was not whether the Browns truly lived off-grid at all times, but whether they felt like a family living against the grain of modern society. The unraveling of Billy Brown's image did not begin with scandal but with skepticism. Dedicated viewers, those most invested in the show's premise, were the first to notice inconsistencies. Questions arose quietly at first. How could a family so isolated afford advanced equipment? Why did public records place them in multiple states during periods portrayed as deep wilderness survival? Why did locals report seeing the Browns in hotels and rental properties rather than homesteads? These questions were initially dismissed as cynicism. Fans accused skeptics of jealousy or bad faith, reinforcing a familiar cultural reflex to protect comforting myths from disruption. The show's framing encouraged this response. Brown positioned critics as outsiders who didn't understand the family's way of life, subtly casting doubt as a moral failing rather than an intellectual one. Yet skepticism persisted. Investigative bloggers began cross-referencing timelines. Former acquaintances came forward with stories that conflicted sharply with the on-screen narrative. What emerged was not a single contradiction but a pattern, a sense that the wilderness story functioned less as lived reality and more as a flexible backdrop for a pre-written myth. Importantly, these early revelations did not collapse the narrative. Instead, they revealed its resilience. Brown's authority as narrator allowed him to absorb doubt without confronting it. The myth bent, but it did not break. One of the most striking features of Billy Brown's persona was its moral insulation. As the patriarch, he occupied a position beyond scrutiny. His authority derived not from transparency but from performance, calm in crisis, decisive in danger, poetic in reflection. The show rarely depicted him being meaningfully challenged by his children or spouse. Disagreement, when it appeared, was framed as a lesson rather than a threat. This dynamic mirrors broader patterns in charismatic leadership. When authority is rooted in narrative rather than accountability, questioning becomes destabilizing. To doubt the leader is to doubt the story itself, and by extension, one's own investment in it. Brown's children, raised within this framework, learned loyalty not merely as a family value but as a survival strategy. The family's financial stability, public identity, and sense of purpose were all tethered to the myth Billy sustained. Thus, the early signs of deception were not merely ignored, they were structurally suppressed. The architecture of belief was too complete, too interdependent, to allow easy descent. Brown's double life began to surface publicly after his death. The groundwork for deception had been laid for decades. His wilderness persona was not a mask hastily donned for television, but a carefully authored identity that shaped how others perceived and interacted with him. The myth did not simply hide his lies, it enabled them. In the chapters that follow, this work will move beyond the construction of the public persona to examine what it concealed: secret relationships, financial manipulation, and emotional exploitation. But those revelations cannot be understood in isolation. They are the logical extensions of a life lived as narrative, a man who learned that belief, once secured, could be bent to serve almost any purpose. The private man and the multiplication of selves, intimacy, deception, and emotional power ****. If Alaskan Bush People established Billy Brown as a mythic public figure, his private life reveals the cost of sustaining that myth across decades. What emerged after his death was not a single betrayal or lapse in judgment, but a sustained pattern of duplicity so intricate that it required the deliberate fragmentation of identity. Billy Brown did not merely live a double life, he perfected the art of multiplying selves, each calibrated to the emotional, financial, and psychological needs of the moment. This chapter examines the hidden relationships that ran parallel to Brown's public life, most notably the long-term relationship described by Kathleen D., but also the corroborating testimonies of other women and associates who came forward. These accounts do more than expose infidelity. They illuminate a deeper structure of emotional manipulation in which intimacy itself became a tool, an extension of the same narrative authority Brown exercised on television. In private, as in public, he was not simply lying, he was authoring realities. Central to Brown's private deceptions was his ability to make individuals feel uniquely selected. Kathleen's account follows a disturbingly consistent pattern seen in charismatic manipulators: the cultivation of exclusivity. According to her testimony, Brown framed himself as a man trapped in circumstances beyond his control, married in name only, bound by obligation, and yearning for escape. This narrative positioned Kathleen not as a secret, but as a future. She was invited into what appeared to be an inner sanctum of truth, a space where the real Billy resided. Psychologically, this dynamic is powerful. To be chosen as the confidant of a man who presents himself as misunderstood and burdened is to be elevated above the ordinary. Brown's confessions, his frustrations, dreams, and supposed moral struggles, created an illusion of vulnerability. Yet vulnerability, in this context, was not mutual. It flowed in one direction only, binding Kathleen emotionally while preserving Brown's control. What distinguishes Brown's behavior from casual infidelity is duration. Maintaining such a relationship for nearly 30 years required not only deception, but discipline. 2 phones, carefully managed travel narratives, and compartmentalized social circles point to a man for whom lying had become habitual, even banal. This was not chaos, it was administration. Perhaps the most damning aspect of the posthumous revelations is not Kathleen's story alone, but how closely it aligns with others. Women who came forward independently described strikingly similar experiences: promises of eventual separation from his wife, financial requests framed as investments, appeals for patience grounded in an endlessly complicated family situation. The repetition suggests not improvisation, but script. This consistency mirrors Brown's public storytelling. Just as episodes of Alaskan Bush People followed recognizable narrative beats: crisis, perseverance, moral lesson, his private relationships unfolded along predictable arcs. Initial charm gave way to emotional dependency, which in turn justified financial entanglement and prolonged secrecy. When contradictions arose, Brown responded not with accountability, but with reframing. Doubt became impatience. Suspicion became a failure to understand his vision. Such tactics align with what scholars of coercive control describe as reality distortion, the gradual erosion of another person's confidence in their own judgment. Brown's partners were not merely deceived, they were persuaded to reinterpret their discomfort as personal weakness. In this sense, emotional manipulation functioned as a form of authorship. Brown edited other people's perceptions of events, much as he edited reality for viewers of his show. While romance provided emotional sustenance, money provided leverage. Kathleen's claims of significant financial loss are echoed by former associates who described being drawn into Brown's grand visions: land developments, sustainable communities, publishing ventures. These schemes shared a common feature: they were always on the verge of success, perpetually deferred by bad luck or external interference. Financial manipulation served multiple purposes. It extended relationships by creating shared stakes. It reinforced Brown's image as a visionary rather than a dependent. And crucially, it shifted risk onto others. Those who invested not only lost money, but became complicit in the illusion. To admit deception would be to acknowledge personal misjudgment, a psychologically difficult step that often prolonged silence. This dynamic parallels the relationship between Brown and his audience. Viewers invested emotionally in the family's narrative, defending it against critics because abandoning belief would mean confronting their own susceptibility to fiction. In both cases, Brown benefited from the human tendency to protect investments, emotional or financial, even when evidence suggests they were misplaced. What allows a person to sustain such contradictions without apparent psychological collapse? The answer lies in compartmentalization, the ability to separate conflicting identities so completely that they never collide. Brown's public self, the devoted husband, moral patriarch, and spiritual guide, existed independently of his private self as lover, borrower, and manipulator. Compartmentalization is often misunderstood as weakness. In reality, it can be a sophisticated defense mechanism, particularly in individuals who see themselves as narrators rather than participants in their own lives. Brown did not experience his lies as contradictions, he experienced them as context-dependent truths. Each version of himself was real within its own narrative frame. This explains why confrontation rarely produced confession. When challenged, Brown reportedly became defensive, even indignant. From his perspective, the accuser was disrupting the story rather than exposing a lie. This moral inversion, where truth-telling becomes aggression, is a hallmark of deeply entrenched deception. One of the most troubling questions raised by these revelations is why they emerged only after Brown's death. The answer is not fear alone, though fear played a role. Shame is equally powerful. Victims of long-term manipulation often internalize responsibility, believing they should have known better. Speaking out risks public judgment and private humiliation. Kathleen's decision to remain silent for years reflects this reality. Her stated concern for Brown's children suggests a moral restraint that contrasts sharply with Brown's own behavior. It also underscores a cruel irony: those most harmed by deception often feel the greatest obligation to protect others from its fallout. Only after Brown's death did the balance shift. Without his presence to enforce narrative control, space opened for alternative truths. As more voices joined, the story gained coherence, not because it was rehearsed, but because it was shared. Billy Brown's private life was not a shadow cast accidentally by fame, it was an extension of the same narrative impulse that fueled his public success. Intimacy, like wilderness survival, became another story to be told, another space to exert control. The women who believed in him were not anomalies, they were audiences of a different kind. In understanding Brown's hidden relationships, we confront an uncomfortable truth about charisma itself. The qualities that make someone compelling, confidence, vision, narrative fluency, can just as easily enable harm when untethered from accountability. Brown did not simply deceive individuals, he trained them to believe. Economies of illusion, money, legitimacy, and the performance of self-sufficiency ***. If Billy Brown's emotional duplicity revealed the personal cost of myth-making, his financial history exposes the institutional scaffolding that allowed that myth to endure. Money, in Brown's world, was never merely a resource, it was a narrative instrument. Through financial opacity, strategic misrepresentation, and the careful cultivation of hardship, Brown transformed economic dependency into proof of virtue, and fraud into frontier ingenuity. This chapter examines how financial deception functioned not as an auxiliary flaw but as a central mechanism in the maintenance of Brown's public identity. One of the most persuasive elements of Alaskan Bush People was its portrayal of economic scarcity. The Browns were shown as perpetually on the brink, scraping together supplies, improvising solutions, and enduring deprivation with stoic resolve. This aesthetic of poverty served an important symbolic function. It framed suffering as authenticity and scarcity as moral credibility. To struggle visibly was to prove one's independence from modern excess. Yet this representation was profoundly misleading. Court records and financial disclosures later revealed that Billy Brown had been earning a substantial income from the show for years, placing him firmly within the economic structures he claimed to reject. The family's repeated public claims of hardship, sometimes accompanied by solicitations of fan support, stand in stark contrast to the reality of their earnings. This dissonance was not accidental. It was a calculated performance designed to preserve the illusion of wilderness purity. In this sense, Brown weaponized poverty as symbolism. By appearing economically marginal, he insulated himself from scrutiny. Wealth invites investigation, hardship invites sympathy. The myth required the latter. The most concrete evidence of Brown's financial deception emerged in 2015, when he and his son Joshua were charged with theft related to Alaska's Permanent Fund Dividend Program. The allegations, that the Browns falsely claimed residency in Alaska while spending extended periods elsewhere, undermined the very foundation of the show's premise. Residency, after all, was not merely legal status, it was symbolic proof of belonging to the wilderness. Brown's guilty plea marked a rare moment when narrative collapsed under institutional pressure. Yet even this episode was absorbed into the myth rather than dismantling it. Brown framed the charges as technical misunderstandings, external persecution, or bureaucratic overreach, classic rhetorical strategies employed by figures who position themselves as outsiders to corrupt systems. His suspended sentence, granted on medical grounds, further blurred accountability. What is striking is not merely the fraud itself, but its ordinariness. Brown's actions align with a pattern of small, accumulative deceptions that prioritize narrative continuity over legality. Survival, in his worldview, justified bending rules. This logic mirrors frontier mythology, where lawlessness is often recast as moral autonomy. Brown did not see himself as stealing, he saw himself as navigating an unjust system. Beyond public benefits, Brown's financial world was characterized by a series of opaque business ventures, LLCs, land deals, and publishing projects that projected legitimacy without producing sustainable value. Former associates described investments that vanished without documentation, ventures perpetually stalled by external forces, and promises that dissolved into ambiguity. These enterprises functioned less as economic engines and more as props. They reinforced Brown's self-presentation as a visionary entrepreneur while deflecting attention from his reliance on others' capital. Complexity itself became a shield. By layering transactions and entities, Brown made scrutiny difficult and accountability diffuse. This strategy parallels his emotional manipulation. Just as he overwhelmed intimate partners with narrative detail and future promises, he overwhelmed investors with vision. In both cases, clarity was postponed indefinitely in favor of momentum. Brown's financial deceptions cannot be understood without examining the role of reality television as an enabling institution. Alaskan Bush People did not merely document Brown's life, it monetised his narrative authority. The network benefited directly from the myth's endurance and had little incentive to interrogate its foundations. Authenticity, in this context, was less important than plausibility. Reality television operates on a paradox: it markets truth while relying on performance. Brown excelled within this structure because he understood its demands intuitively. He provided compelling content, moral coherence, and emotional stakes, all while maintaining enough ambiguity to deflect verification. The result was a mutually reinforcing relationship between subject and platform, where deception became profitable. This complicity raises uncomfortable ethical questions. At what point does storytelling become exploitation? When does the audience's desire for authenticity excuse institutional blindness? Brown was not alone in sustaining the illusion. He was supported by an ecosystem that rewarded narrative over fact. After Brown's death in 2021, the financial architecture he built began to unravel rapidly. Without his narrative authority to manage contradictions, inconsistencies became liabilities. Investigators traced patterns of misrepresentation. Former associates spoke openly. The myth, once cohesive, fragmented under scrutiny. For the Brown children, this collapse carried profound consequences. Financial dependence on the show had limited their capacity to question its authenticity. The very structure that provided security also enforced silence. When that structure weakened, they were left not only to grieve a father, but to renegotiate their relationship to money, labor, and truth. Billy Brown's financial deceptions were not ancillary to his myth, they were integral to it. Money flowed through his life as story rather than substance, legitimacy rather than ledger. By aestheticizing poverty, obscuring income, and framing fraud as survival, he sustained an identity that could not withstand transparency. In the next section, this work will turn to the most enduring victims of this architecture of illusion, the Brown children and Amy Brown, whose lives were shaped, unconstrained, by a narrative they did not fully author. Their reckoning with inheritance, loyalty, and loss marks the emotional core of Brown's legacy. The most enduring consequences of Billy Brown's deceptions were not borne by distant audiences or defrauded associates, but by the people who lived within the narrative he authored, his wife and children. Unlike viewers, they could not turn off the television or step away from the myth without losing their sense of home, identity, and survival. For the Brown family, belief was not optional, it was inherited. This chapter examines how Billy's myth functioned as a system of control within the family, how loyalty became indistinguishable from complicity, and how truth, when it finally emerged, arrived not as liberation but as rupture. From the earliest seasons of Alaskan Bush People, the Brown family was framed as a self-contained moral universe. External society was depicted as hostile, corrupt, or fundamentally incompatible with the Browns' way of life. This framing had a powerful insulating effect. By positioning the family against the world, Billy created an environment where internal dissent could be interpreted as betrayal rather than disagreement. Such closed narrative systems are common in charismatic households. They rely on a binary worldview: inside equals safety and meaning, outside equals danger and misunderstanding. Within this framework, questioning the patriarch's authority threatens not only emotional bonds but existential security. For the Brown children, whose education, socialization, and income were all mediated by the family structure, the cost of skepticism was total. This dynamic helps explain the remarkable durability of Billy's authority. Even as inconsistencies became visible, they were rationalized as misunderstandings, production necessities, or attacks by outsiders who didn't get it. Loyalty was not merely encouraged, it was necessary for survival. The Brown children were not passive participants in their father's myth. On screen, they functioned as narrative extensions of Billy's philosophy, evidence that his worldview worked. Their apparent competence, obedience, and affection were repeatedly showcased as outcomes of his leadership. Yet this visibility came at a cost. Childhood, ordinarily a space for experimentation and dissent, was transformed into performance. The children learned early that their value, both within the family and to the outside world, was tied to their ability to embody the story. Authentic emotion had to be carefully managed. Conflict, when shown, was resolved within the moral framework Billy provided. As the children grew older, this arrangement became increasingly fraught. Some, like Bear Brown, hinted publicly at internal conflict after Billy's death. His cryptic reflections on betrayal and disillusionment suggest a painful process of re-evaluation, reconciling genuine memories of love and guidance with the revelation of systemic deceit. Loving a parent who has lied extensively creates a moral paradox with no clean resolution. Others responded through withdrawal. Matthew Brown's gradual disappearance from the show has been widely interpreted as resistance to the performative life Billy demanded. His absence functions as a silent critique, a refusal to continue lending his identity to a narrative he no longer believed. It is tempting to categorize the Brown children as either victims or accomplices. In reality, they occupied an ethically ambiguous space shaped by power asymmetry and dependency. As minors, and later as financially dependent adults, they lacked meaningful agency. The show was not merely a job, it was the infrastructure of their lives. This dependency complicates judgments of complicity. To speak out would have meant jeopardizing the family's livelihood and fracturing already fragile bonds. Silence, while morally troubling in hindsight, was often the least harmful option available. In this sense, the children's complicity was coerced, produced by a system that rewarded compliance and punished deviation. The psychological toll of such constraint is evident in the children's posthumous responses to their father's exposure. Grief became entangled with anger, loyalty with resentment. They were forced to mourn not only a parent, but the version of themselves they might have become outside the myth. No figure embodies the cost of belief more fully than Amy Brown. Married to Billy as a teenager and isolated from conventional social structures, she lived her entire adult life within the world he designed. Her role was both central and constrained, the moral anchor of the family, yet largely voiceless in shaping its public narrative. Amy's endurance has often been framed as strength, and in many respects it was. She raised children under extreme conditions, navigated legal and financial crises, and faced a life-threatening cancer diagnosis with public composure. Yet endurance can also function as erasure. The expectation that she remained loyal, silent, and supportive left little room for self-definition beyond her role as wife and mother. Reports that Amy suspected infidelity long before it became public add a tragic dimension to her story. Suspicion without confirmation traps individuals in a liminal state, unable to confront or escape. Her conservative upbringing and economic dependence further narrowed her options. To acknowledge the full truth would have meant dismantling the only life she had ever known. When revelations about Billy's double life emerged after his death, Amy's response was marked by restraint. She did not publicly condemn him. Instead, she emphasized forgiveness and faith, prioritizing her children's stability over personal vindication. This choice, while admirable, underscores the asymmetry of the damage inflicted. Billy's deception ended with his death, Amy's reckoning did not. Billy Brown's death did not resolve the contradictions he left behind. Instead, it transferred them to those who survived him. The family was forced to grieve in public while navigating revelations that complicated every memory. Moments once cherished became suspect. Teachings once revered required reinterpretation. Grief under such conditions is uniquely destabilizing. It denies mourners the comfort of uncomplicated remembrance. For the Brown family, mourning became an ethical exercise, how to honor genuine love without endorsing lies, how to acknowledge harm without erasing good. Inheritance, in the Brown family, was not limited to property or fame. It included belief systems, silences, and unresolved contradictions. Billy Brown did not simply deceive his family, he conscripted them into sustaining the deception, often without their full understanding or consent. As the final section will explore, the broader legacy of Billy Brown raises urgent questions about truth in media, the ethics of storytelling, and the human cost of myths we are too eager to believe. What remains after the illusion collapses is not clarity, but responsibility, to remember honestly, to grieve ethically, and to build futures no longer tethered to performance.